Who is Jacob Arminius? He's the man that lies behind this. First of all, what is this guy's name? We see it many different ways. When his parents named him, this is what we think it was: Jacob Harmonzone. The Latin became Jacobus Arminius, and though it comes into English, therefore, as Jacob Arminius. The setting for all of this is the United States or provinces of the Netherlands. This is a map with the different province names on it. The lowlands, the Reformation, persecution, and revolt is what preceded Arminius. The Reformation came early to the Netherlands. It came from Germany into the Netherlands, the Lutheran Reformation. But it wasn't long that Calvinism came through the French people, and Calvinism completely took over the Reformation in the Netherlands. They were staunchly Calvinistic. Persecution also came early under the emperor who ruled over this land somewhat loosely, and then was his son, Philip, who took over, and the persecution was fierce and bitter. Thousands of people burned at the stake, were buried alive, had their tongues torn out, all sorts of horrible treatment because they confessed the truth of the Reformation. The Dutch resistance over against the Spanish rule came into its own in 1566 when William of Orange sided with these people, with those who were against Spain. He had been a minister under an official under the emperor, and now he joined the Dutch in their resistance. When he was assassinated, his young son would assume some of the role of the leader. This went on for some time, but in 1609, in the providence of God, just before the Synod could be held, a truce was signed with Spain, a 12-year truce from 1609 that enabled the country then to deal with the problem of Arminianism. The churches in the Netherlands were well established. They had consistories, they held meetings of classis and provincial synods, even some national synods. The first one in 1578, where they decided every 3 years they would have a national synod. Well, they had two of them, but then there would not be another one until the Great Synod in 1618. It was a confessional church. They maintained the Heidelberg Catechism and the Belgic Confession. But there was heavy state involvement in the church. The local officials had something to do with the calling of the minister, with who controlled the church building. Even the care of the poor was often taken over by the local officials. And there were unreformed pastors that had come up in the churches. Some of them, of course, came out of Rome and never really adopted the Reformation, and others were influenced by other bad ministers. Some of the things that they had in common, they were all men who came into conflict with the confessions at one point or another. And they all objected in some way to sovereign, particular predestination, that God selected certain individuals unto salvation in Jesus Christ. Their errors regarding predestination led them into other errors, notably the doctrine of justification by faith alone. They were all also Erastian in their church polity. They wanted the government to be fully involved in the government of the church because the government was not as reformed as the consistories were. And the government would often protect men who were preaching false doctrine. And therefore they can continue in their office. Even though the consistory said, we don't want you any longer, the local government would give them place to preach. In that setting is Jacob Arminius, born in 1560 in a small town of Oudewater in the province of Utrecht. His father died early. His mother and his siblings were killed in the Spanish War. The Spanish went through the town and killed almost everyone there, and he happened to be not there, and he survived. He was obviously therefore very poor, but he was supported because he was a very intelligent, a very bright young man, and he was supported to be able to go into the ministry. He studied in Leyden University. That's where he got his major theological degree. And then he went to Geneva, and he was able to study there under Beza, who was some 80 years old, and a friend named Eitan Bogart. He went to Basel in Switzerland, and a little while to Italy. So he had a a fairly broad education in many of the Reformation centers, though it's not clear exactly why he went to Italy. That was certainly not a part of the Reformation. He had glowing letters of recommendation, both from Geneva and from Basel, both of which were staunchly in favor of sovereign grace and sovereign predestination, double predestination. He had glowing letters of recommendation. So at this point, he is not telling anyone what he believed about reprobation and election, as he would later reveal. He was examined by Classis Amsterdam, and he was ordained in 1588. And so as a minister there, he began to preach. And there was trouble when he began to preach on the book of Romans, because when he got to chapter 7, the good that I would, said Paul, Arminius said, that's Paul when he was not regenerated. So here is an unregenerated Paul able to will the good, having some kind of a free will. A fellow pastor named Plancius protested some of those sermons, and apparently it was worked out that Arminius smoothed it over and convinced them that he didn't believe that man had a free will. When he got to chapter 9, he said, God chooses the elect who will believe. He chooses those whom he looks ahead and will believe. Once again, there were objections to his sermons, but nothing seemed to come to a head, at least to bring him to the point of being put out of office. He was asked at this time to refute positions on predestination that were being taught by a man by the name of Koolhaas, and he agreed to do this, but he never did. And so his particular views on predestination never became public. He always kept them to himself. At this time, in the University of Leyden, a man by the name of Francis Junius, a theological professor, died in a plague in 1602, and Arminius was appointed to replace him, and he would become then a theological professor teaching future ministers of the gospel. Francis Gomarus was another theological professor in that same university, and he was a staunch Calvinist, and he would be someone that would become the chief opponent of Arminius. So the trouble now moves to Leyden, and before Arminius could take a position there, a conference was held in which Gomarus really examined Arminius on his views of grace and particularly predestination. And at that point, Arminius promised he would teach nothing but what the confessions taught. And on that basis, Gomarus said he could be approved, and Arminius began to teach. But the conflict continued to come up, and there were many conferences between 1605 and 1609 that involved Arminius and what he was teaching. There were calls during this time for a national synod, and the people who supported Arminius' view wanted a national synod in order to change the confessions, but that the Reformed Church was not willing to do. Arminius himself published almost nothing his entire lifetime. There are volumes printed after he died, but again, while he was alive, he printed almost nothing. Arminius' teaching in Leyden, one of the students there said this about his teaching. I observed among a number of fellow students enrolled in the private theological class of Dr. Arminius many things that, had I been ignorant, might have easily led me into dark and abominable errors. For in that class they were utterly drawn away from reading the works and treatises of Calvin, Beza, Zanchi, Martyr, Ursinus, Piscator, and Perkins, all staunch Calvinists, and other learned and valuable theologians of the Church of Christ. We were commanded to examine only Holy Scripture, but equally so the writings of Socinius, a heretic, Acontius, Castellio, a heretic, Thomas Aquinas, Molina, and Suarez, two of those Roman Catholics, and other enemies of grace were commended to us. The heresy spread. Arminius died in 1609. His followers were a minority of the ministers in the Reformed churches. But 43 of those men met together in Den Haag, in The Hague, in 1610 and drew up a petition for the government asking for protection. That petition was called a Remonstrants, and therefore they took on the name Remonstrants. They were petitioning the government to protect them and their theological beliefs. And they drew up then 5 articles of their belief on salvation. Number 1, God elects those whom He foresees will believe and persevere in obedience unto the end of their lives. The rest God leaves to perish in their unbelief. 2, Christ died for all and merited salvation for all, but only those who believe will receive the benefits. 3, man is sinful and corrupt, and apart from grace cannot believe or save himself. Now that sounds totally orthodox, because it is. And the reason it's orthodox was the confessions were so clear on total depravity that there was no way that they could sneak something into that would be heretical. It was totally impossible. Number 4, but they didn't believe number 3. Number 4, one is saved only by God's grace, but that grace is resistible. And number 5, all those who are united by faith to Christ have the power to persevere. Whether anyone who is saved actually does persevere, in other words, you can be saved, but whether you will persevere to the end and enter heaven, they said, we can't be sure about that. We're not sure what Scripture teaches. The conflict comes to a climax. The counter-remonstrants drew up the Reformed position over against those 5 points. There was tremendous resistance against a national synod in order to deal with the doctrinal controversies, but eventually a national synod was authorized in 1618, and the synod came together. Jacob Arminius is the man that's behind it. Even though he's long dead before the synod meets, he is the man God ordained to bring about these doctrinal controversies so that the great synod of 1618-19 would be called Safeguarding the Reformation.